First of all, I want to say a big heartfelt thank you to all of you who've come from near and far to participate in this timely conference of AJCs. I especially want to say thank you because I think I may be the only one with the opportunity to do so to those who have spent literally months conceptualizing, organizing, and implementing this conference. As you know, when things go smoothly, it's not because it was easy. It's because an awful lot of work went into making sure that it looked easy to you. So thank you to our Brussels office. Thank you to our other European offices. Thank you to my colleagues in New York and Washington for helping make this event so timely and well run. I want to begin by explaining very briefly why I'm standing here. I'm standing here firstly, and most obviously, because I'm representing AJC in trying to give verbal expression, as Andy Baker said, to what we think on the subject. But I'm also standing here for a couple of other reasons. I'm standing here because I love Europe and I believe in Europe. Because I have for a long time been dubbed the Europhile in chief of AJC and perhaps the American Jewish community more broadly. Because I believe that what Robert Schuman and Jean Monnet and Paul-Henri Spaak and Alcide de Gasperi and other visionaries after the war were able to achieve is beyond the imagination and understanding of most people today, who either take the European Union for granted or tend to reduce it to a set of problematic issues, such as the Eurozone crisis, without grasping the essential fact that above all, and it took the Nobel Peace Prize Committee too long, in my judgment, to acknowledge it, that Europe is the most ambitious and successful peace project in modern history. And that at the center of the peace project is the protection of human dignity. More than the standardization of light bulbs, more than other trade issues, it must never be forgotten. War has been eliminated from the European continent, a continent so soaked with blood, both Jewish and non-Jewish blood, that the very idea of what has been achieved is almost unthinkable but for those visionaries. And I'm also here because I am a child of Europe, both mother and father, the unwanted Jews of Europe, who miraculously were able to survive and to find a new life and a new beginning in America. But at the same time, I am the husband and father of 4 European Union citizens. So both on a professional and on a personal level, the conversations we have had since last night represent a profound set of issues which are indeed, as we have said, a defining moment. And I dare say not just a defining moment for Europe, but for each of us. Because how we, each of us, react to the events unfolding and the events having been described is no less important definitionally than how others react. Allow me to look back for a moment before looking ahead. And I say this not out of some desire to embarrass, but rather because I think we need to set the framework. For many years, we had concluded at AJC that our destiny was to be the Cassandra among the nations. That somehow, as the Greek mythological character Cassandra had been destined by the god that she had spurned, romantically, that our destiny was to see the truth and not to be heeded. In the second half of the 1990s, we began to speak to our friends in Europe at the very highest levels about what we call the 3 I's: immigration, integration, and identity. We were saying to our friends that no strategy is not a solution to emerging problems. Immigration doesn't solve itself. integration doesn't solve itself. And identity formation under those circumstances does not solve itself. But too often, we were treated respectfully, but ultimately we were humored. Here come the Jews, perhaps to distract us from the alleged crimes of Israel, or here come the Americans trying to bring Europe down a notch. Neither was the case, neither is the case today, to the contrary. As a Jew and as an American, I have a profound stake in Europe's success. We collectively have a profound stake in helping ensure that this extraordinary experiment unfolding in the increasing multicultural climate of Europe succeeds and not fails, for a whole host of obvious reasons. And then by 2000, 2001, when I was living in Geneva, Switzerland, Sabine, and we first met, we began to see the emerging threats to Jews specifically. Jews as Jews. As Mark said in the earlier panel, it was not the beginning. The beginning was in the 60s and 70s. But this was the beginning of a new chapter. And I must tell you that in our conversations in 2000, 2001, 2002, in particular with French authorities, Gilles, were enormously frustrating. They simply adamantly, stubbornly refused to understand the specificity, and I underscore the word specificity, of what was happening. Jews were being singled out as Jews qua Jews. And instead we were being told, you don't understand our country. These are acts of criminality. No, they are not acts of criminality when Jews are being sought out as Jews for being Jews. No, but you don't understand. This is the regrettable importation of the Arab-Israeli conflict to European soil. Well, again, I'm terribly sorry, Monsieur le Président, Monsieur le Ministre des Affaires étrangères. I'm terribly sorry. Attacks on Jews in Europe can never be justified by acts occurring elsewhere. Jews in Europe are not proxies for a government, and to be seen as proxies for a government is itself a concern for all of us, or at least it should be, it must be. And I could go on in meeting after meeting in Paris, and yes, here in Brussels, including with EU commissioners at the time, who simply refused to see the problem. And among the reasons why they refused to see the problem, and there was a hint on the earlier panel, was because now the threats were coming from politically inconvenient sources. When Carpentras occurred in Paris, as was referred to, when the sources were neo-Nazis, the extreme right, for the political classes, the intellectual classes of Europe, the response was relatively easy and quick. But suddenly, when the threat began coming from Islamists on European soil, including second and third generation, not first generation, then it became much more linguistically difficult to find expression for this. After all, one has to understand, we were told, Europe is burdened by layers of colonial guilt. This is not an easy issue for us. How can we single out a community which in turn we also view as marginalized and impoverished? And yet we heard, and we know, that not all of the perpetrators were either impoverished or uneducated. But nonetheless, we had this challenge. And I must say that though it was expressed on the earlier panel that politicians today get it, the issue is not calls to action, rather it's implementation of existing calls to action, including AJCs, I beg to differ. It is partially grasped by politicians. It is indeed grasped by François Hollande and Manuel Valls. It is indeed grasped by David Cameron today. And it is indeed grasped by Angela Merkel. I don't wish to offer an exhaustive list, but I will add that it is not fully grasped by many other European leaders who still refuse to bring clarity of language and analysis to the issues, neither with respect to the specificity of anti-Semitism, nor, I may add, with respect to the Israel dimension of the discussion. And we're still waiting. So we have different levels of awareness that we're grappling with. And yet, we need not just the national responses of the 28 member states, and yes, Sabine, countries like Switzerland, which are not, or Norway, and yes, I don't exclude my own country, the United States, which is represented here at this meeting by our good friend Ira Foreman, who will be speaking on the next panel. But we must have regional and ultimately global cooperation if we're to have a chance. Let's take the issue of Mehdi Nemmouche. Mehdi Nemmouche, the perpetrator of the killings here in Brussels exactly 1 year ago this month. And let's consider 4 elements about Mehdi Nemmouche as a case study in what we're discussing. Mehdi Nemmouche was a French citizen, but the crime was committed in Belgium because with the laudable Schengen Agreement, there is no border between France and Belgium. Hence, what happens in France does not stay in France. What happens in Belgium does not stay in Belgium. Second, as AJC began saying to interior and justice ministers in Europe 15 years ago, look at the prisons. Pay attention to what's going on once you lock up people, including common criminals. A process of radicalization is occurring in too many prisons. And by the way, how do we know? Because it was happening in the United States as well. These are problems not exclusive to any one region of the world. And sure enough, Mehdi Nemmouche was being radicalized in prison. Number 3, follow the foreign fighters. Mehdi Nemmouche was a foreign fighter. Foreign fighters don't just simply go from France to Syria. They take routes. And increasingly, in order to avoid surveillance, they take indirect routes because they know by now that just about every flight to Istanbul is being watched by just about every agency in the world. And number 4, last October we were in Singapore. Mehdi Nemmouche passed through Singapore on his way back to Europe. The Singaporean equivalent of the FBI told us, volunteered to us, that they had reason for concern when Mehdi Nemmouche arrived at Singapore airport. But when they searched the databases, they could not find his name. But his name was known here, in Europe, as a name of suspicion. But because Europe has still not gotten together on the PNR, the passenger name records, Singapore lost its opportunity to detain Mehdi Nemmouche, and as a result, 4 people today are dead, and 2 young Israeli girls have been orphaned as both their parents were murdered in this city 1 year ago, May 24th. Those 4 elements, to me, speak about the urgent necessity of regional cooperation, and yes, transatlantic and global cooperation, not tomorrow, not the day after, but yesterday. And yet we still find, even with the PNR, that we're witnessing debates over privacy and personal freedoms versus national security and the like. Finally, as we look at the call to action, we're also saying a couple of other things. When we speak to European and other leaders today, the one-word answer they give us for what they are increasingly recognizing as a serious and long-term problem is the answer, education. Well, who would argue with education? To the contrary, yes, yes, yes to education. But now let's pause for a moment and deconstruct the word and how we get from here to there. What exactly does education mean in the 21st century in a changing Europe demographically, for example? Some would argue we must teach the Shoah, and indeed in certain countries of Europe, it's obligatory to teach the Shoah. Wonderful. But that also presupposes that the teachers are able and willing to teach about the Shoah, and that the students are receptive to what they are hearing. And yet, we know, in some French schools, and not only French schools, we know that the students are not willing to be taught the Shoah. Rather, they reject the teaching of the Shoah, and instead claim it is a Jewish lie to justify the creation of the state of Israel. And after all, if the teacher and the administrators want to know what a real Shoah is, then they should understand the Palestinian Nakba. So, yes to education. But how do you teach in the 21st century about events that occurred 70 to 75 years ago, where the eyewitnesses, the survivors, are disappearing on a daily basis, not to be replaced, where teachers are not sure of their own footing in whether they can pursue this, and where many students push back and push back hard? I must also tell you that while I'm a fan of memorials and monuments and museums, we shouldn't kid ourselves. We mustn't kid ourselves. I was invited to speak at Mauthausen last year together with the presidents of Austria, Hungary, and Poland, and with then Minister of Justice of Israel, Tzipi Livni. The first three, the presidents of Poland, Hungary, and Austria, honored us by their presence at Mauthausen, and each spoke very movingly, except for two things in my judgment. And this is my point. And let me be brutally honest. And I speak as a child of survivors. I'm not interested in attending events which focus on dead Jews if living Jews are not part of the discussion. I mourn as others mourn, even as I know I cannot bring back the 6 million lives and rebuild the infrastructure of Jewish community that was an essential part of the fabric and landscape of this continent for centuries. So I honor their memory as other leaders must. But how can one talk about Mauthausen then, or Dachau then, or Belzec then, or Babi Yar then, or Birkenau then, without making reference to the challenges of today? The challenges of today in which the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union learned that in 3 EU countries, more than 40% of Jews have considered emigrating. If that's not an alarm bell, what is? If what happened in Toulouse and Paris, in Brussels and Copenhagen, what happened in Sarcelles and Créteil and elsewhere are not alarm bells, what is? And I will add to what Mark of CST said. It's not just that the events of January and February illustrated what we've tried to say all along. Anti-Semitism may begin with Jews, but history has taught it never ends with Jews. Anti-Semitism is a cancer that left unchecked will metastasize, and ultimately it will destroy the democratic and pluralistic fabric of a society. But here's the distinction. If necessary, God forbid, the Jews of Europe will leave. Fortunately, Israel exists. An Israel which too many in Europe today and elsewhere do not begin to understand as a living, breathing, sovereign, democratic reality that, yes, has its challenges and, yes, makes its mistakes, but has every right to exist no less than any European or other country. So the Jews will leave, and by the way, when you look at the counts of Aliyah from France or Belgium, there's a number missing. The Jews who have left and resettled in Canada, in the United States, and elsewhere, whom we cannot count because they're not recorded as Jews. So add to the numbers making Aliyah. So if necessary, heaven forbid, the Jews will leave. But where will Europe go? Europe has nowhere to go but to stay. And the question then becomes whether it stays and stands up and defends its noble, laudable core values, or whether it succumbs. It succumbs to whatever impulse leads it to succumb. And my very last point, each of us has much to contribute. The governments represented here, the governments of the United States, of France, of Germany, the ambassadors of many countries that are here, the ambassador of Hungary, the ambassador of Sweden, and others that I've seen, civil society, Jewish communities, we all have a role to play. But I believe as much as anything, the future depends on the three people in the first panel we had today. As much as anything, the future depends on them and those like them. Yahya, Haras, and Saud. Those three people who have the courage, the commitment, the conviction, as proud Muslims, to stand up and say, I will not allow my faith tradition to be hijacked by others in the name of extremism, fundamentalism, violence, murder, jihad. And they come here as they have gone elsewhere in order to say those things to other Muslims and to the larger world. For AJC, our relationship with that panel and those like them that we have identified around the world is perhaps the single most important relationship we have going into the 21st century. And my hope, and I leave you with this, is that one day we will have such panels, not of individuals alone, Yahya, but of the executive director of the counterpart of AJC, representing a larger institution, a network of thousands and tens of thousands of people who stand up day after day to defend a set of core values. Because as has been said, and I wish to stress, at the end of the day, this is not about clashes of religion. This is about clashes of values and clashes within religions. Samuel Huntington didn't have it quite right. The real story are the clashes within civilizations. And those clashes are between people who share common values of democracy, of pluralism, and of mutual respect. And I deliberately avoid the word tolerance. My threshold, AJC's threshold, for the kind of world we seek to build is not based on tolerance. I don't wish to tolerate you. I don't wish to be tolerated by you. I wish to understand and respect you. I wish to be understood and respected. So we need you, Yahya. We need you, Haras. We need you, Suad. We need people like you to stand up, and I assure you, we will stand with you. Thank you.